Morning, everyone. Welcome back. It's May the 4th. Thank you for coming back and watching. Um, we're going to keep moving along. Unit 4. We're almost there. We're almost at the end. A few things though before we start. Um, Thank you to everybody who over the weekend submitted assignments. I got a lot of them, so I may or may not have got to yours yet. So if you sent something over the weekend and you noticed that I didn't mark it, it means I just didn't get to it yet. That's what today is for. So today I will spend my day marking whatever you sent in so that you can see your progress so far. I would strongly encourage you to keep working hard at your assignments. And just if you have any questions or concerns, please let me know. And the offer still stands for a one-on-one or group Zoom or Google Meet just to answer any questions that you may or may not have. But let's continue with our look at Unit 4, the responding to globalization. We are on student activity 27, so this is page 5 of the booklet, and it's globalization and human rights. So we're going to focus a lot of our time today focusing on what human rights are, how they came about, and how they relate with globalization. So the picture that you see here, we can see a protest. So we are going to focus a lot about the push and the push back when it comes to human rights, because history has seen many an example of where peoples rise up and there's a pushback to it. So we start this video on slide 3. There is a quite an extensive documentary look from PBS, China and Power and Prosperity. You don't have to watch the whole thing. I'd maybe watch a minute or 2 minutes of it, just so you can get the understanding, a slight understanding of the history of China, because we're going to focus our attention a little on China today, just because it does have a lot of challenges when it comes to human rights, and there are some examples of human rights violations that do come out of China. So we will focus our attention a little on China today. But before we do, we kind of need to understand what it means when we talk about this term, universal human rights. So this involves belief in the dignity and worth of all people. If we were in class right now, I would tell you to take out your pen and underline the word all, because it is everybody. And it's regardless of race, gender, nationality, religion, political, anything. Everybody, everyone should be afforded the same sort of human rights. It's not just thing. And so it's a protection from violence, abuse, ignorance, and hatred. So we should all, in an ideal world, be protected from these sort of things. But we're not totally there yet, but we're doing a better job than we were. So it's universal human rights are essentially created to help us get along. We live in a world full of diversity. Thanks to globalization, peoples from around the world have come together, and now they live together, and they live in close proximity. So I think our school is an excellent example of it. When we were in class, if you looked around the room, there were peoples from all over the world sitting right next to each other. People from the different nationalities, so there were different linguistic groups there. There were different cultural groups. It's a Catholic school, but it didn't necessarily mean everybody was Catholic. So there's a lot of different religious groups. But if you take a step back, and you look at, say, a city like ours, or a country like ours, founded a lot of, primarily by immigrants from different countries, you can just look at the interconnection of peoples. living in close proximity to each other. Walk around the neighborhood, and the best way to figure it out is look at the sort of restaurants that are around, the sort of churches or mosques or temples that are around. Then you start to feel and see the diversity that exists. And if we all agree on these basic human rights principles, where we protect each other from violence, abuse, ignorance, and hatred, then you can start to see that, hey, we're all basically the same, just different, but we are all the same. So there is no reason to fear. And the best way to combat ignorance and fear, or the concept of xenophobia, which we did talk about, is things like education. So learning about different peoples and their beliefs and their cultures and things like that starts to help people lose these ideas in their mind that, hey, these people are dangerous, and these people are they're not like us, so we should be wary of them. We should not associate with them. So these sort of things help. Education, because the ideas and principles of the human rights, universal human rights, exist for all people. So we have, as a race, or as humanity, we have organized this. So the United Nations. After World War II, members of the United Nations worked to create the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948. The reason that it came out in the 1940s is because of the Second World War. We saw atrocities, and we saw what later will be called crimes against humanity. So things like the Holocaust, or extermination camps in Japan, and these sort of things. And they are all based, well, primarily in the German case, they're all based on things like race. So in the concentration camp system of the Second World War, you would find Jewish people there. You'd find Slavic peoples there. You would find gypsies there. You'd find people who were politically opposed to the Nazi government. You would find homosexuals. You would find people with physical or mental disabilities. You would find even some Christian groups like Jehovah's Witnesses were put there. So after World War II, we come up with a Declaration of Human Rights. And by signing the Declaration, a country commits to protecting the rights of its citizens. So right then and there, you have the countries of the world signing on to agree to follow the rules that were set out by this declaration. So in the wording, it's called the Declaration. So this is the tricky part. It's not a treaty. If it was a treaty and they signed it, then there is strict rules that have to be followed. So it's not technically legally binding, so it makes it tricky to enforce. If it were a treaty, that means essentially like international laws that can be enforced by an international organization like the United Nations. But a declaration, you kind of have to hope that the people who sign on, they will follow the rules. Now, we'll move on to what this declaration includes, so you can kind of understand what I mean. So the Declaration of Human Rights includes the following. So civil rights. So equal protection under the law, freedom from torture, freedom of thought and expression. So that's the first one. So when I say it's a declaration, so it's really hard to follow. Potentially, you may think that places that are you would imagine having problems with civil rights will come to mind. But for example, I think an excellent example to show you what it means by a declaration not being binding is look at the United States following the Second World War in the 1950s. Well, even throughout their entire history. But you have a civil rights movement that starts in the 1950s. People like Rosa Parks, Martin Luther King, and then later on, a little later on, you get Malcolm X. These are African Americans who are calling for equal protection under the law, freedom from torture or from violence, and then freedom of expression and thought. Because in the United States, that wasn't the case. And it wasn't the case up until the Civil Rights Movement and essentially the assassinations of people like Martin Luther King and Malcolm X. So this is what it means. This is what we're talking about, how it's not a binding treaty, but essentially it's just a declaration. But places like the United States, when it comes to equal treatment of African Americans, it didn't happen right away. And even when we see things nowadays, well, not now, but like further on, we see like the rise of the Black Panther Party and their advocacy and their resistance to a judicial system or law system that was prejudiced towards African Americans. And then you see more recently things like the Black Lives Matter movement, again, still echoing the sort of civil rights issues. So then another example of within these Declaration of Human Rights is social and economic rights. So the right to an adequate standard of living, the right to work, justice in pay and working conditions, freedom from slavery, the right to an education and access to health care. So when we talked about in the last unit things like sweatshops and the exploitation of workers in, say, places like Asia, those sort of things, again, are not being maintained in this declaration, because sweatshop labor can be seen as a form of slavery. It's also an injustice in pay and working conditions, because these people are paid very little and they really don't have any sort of protection. Some companies who use this sort of labor, they don't even have things like maternity leave. So if a woman becomes pregnant, there is no job protection if she wants to, say, take, God forbid, a year off or even a few days off. She could lose her job just because she's pregnant. So, and things like education and healthcare too. Again, things that in Canada that we see as kind of like basic things that you would automatically like it's guaranteed to you. In some countries, it's not. So this, again, it's all because this idea of this declaration, it's not a binding treaty. So we have to remember that. So whenever a country or a group violates these things, I use the word, it's called human rights violations. So these are the crimes that are related to restricting basic human rights. So an example of this is female infanticide. And this is deliberately killing of children in China. So it's female because for a very long time in China they had the one child rule or one child law. I believe it has been lifted now, but if anyone wants to go and look into it, let me know. Where essentially a family was limited to one child. And unfortunately, female children were more commonly killed than male because things like gender inequality, things like family lineage, and these sort of things. And it created quite a gap. So you can look at this this chart or this graph on slide 7. The gap may not be large, but it represents a gender gap of 34 million women in 2011. So that is quite a huge gap. It may not look it, but it is if you think about it in terms of the population. So in China, for example, the age gap from 0 to 19 between male and female was estimated to be 34 million. So that's crazy. Let's move on. So human rights violations and political expression, because China, we're still focusing on China here, is a one-party state. So that means they don't have a mixture of political parties. It's really just the Chinese Communist Party. So China has widely been criticized for its human rights violations. So national security law is created to persecute protesters. So when people protest against the Chinese government, there's laws in place that they can use to try and charge these protesters. So these protesters are usually advocating for things like freedom of speech, association, movement, and religion, and they're often denied these sort of rights. That's why they are challenging them. So and it continues on to things like women's rights are also violated. So in China, we must understand just the layout a little bit. In 1949, we have a revolution in China, and the Communist Party takes over. It's led by a man by the name of Mao Zedong. He takes over, creates a very rigid system of government, and it does restrict quite a lot of freedoms that we have in Canada, for example, that we don't really even. I don't want to say we take them for granted, but we really don't have a fear that someone is going to take them away from us. So these sort of things are a very common occurrence. For example, one of the things that happens in China is the death penalty. It still exists there. Yes, it still exists in other countries as well, but we're focusing our attention on China right now. It's reported up to 10,000 cases a year. And there's also reports of torture, beatings, electric shock, shackling, deprivation of food and water in many state prisons. So when we look at the prison systems of other countries, inmates are allocated specific rights, and one of them is to be prevented from being tortured. And the living conditions, where yes, they are not most pleasant, they are not being deprived of things like food and water, and they are given time for things like sleep, because sleep deprivation or preventing someone from sleeping is also another example of torture. But I also want to just make something clear to you, is that this is not just happening in China, it does happen in other places as well. The death penalty, for example, it is in some U.S. states, and the things like torture and beatings and all these deprivation stuff, it does happen in the Western world as well. Guantanamo Bay, for those of you that don't know, is a military base in Cuba, and it has a notorious history, a very recent history too, of housing in prisoners. It's run by the United States. Just want to make that sure aware too. And there is examples of torture and things like that happening there. So it is happening everywhere. So the violation of human rights, it is very widespread. So that's why when I said we are doing better, but we're not 100% there. So on slide 11, you're going to watch this 8-minute video and answer question 5, 6, and 7. And 8, sorry. And it's the Great Firewall. So it relates to, and I'm just going to kind of spoil this for you. It relates to the internet and restrictions, heavy restrictions by the Chinese government there. So I'll let you watch that and answer those questions, and then we'll move on, but you'll answer those questions and then move on. Okay, so human rights in Canada. So we're going to focus our attention now back on home soil. So, human rights are enshrined in the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. So, all of our rights are all put into this document. So, it ensures freedom of race, religion, sexuality, gender, free speech, all these sort of things, the right to vote. These sort of things are all enshrined in the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. It also includes things as education and equality. So we all have access to education. We all are hopefully treated equally in terms of things like gender and race and stuff like that. Yes, sometimes that doesn't happen because humans are human. But these sort of things are put into law. So that is why you can look at examples of discrimination that have existed in Canada, and they have gone to courts, and they've even gone to the Supreme Court of Canada, the highest court in the land, and they will pull directly from the Charter of Human Rights, or the Charter of Rights and Freedom, sorry, and they will use that as their reason for, and they will use that to get their points across. So many Canadians believe in the rights to free healthcare. So if you ask anybody, they will usually be very accepting and see healthcare as a right that everyone should have. It shouldn't be something where a person, if they can't afford it, then essentially they just have to die. But on the flip side of things, people see our universal healthcare system as overtaxed. There's a shortage of doctors and nurses. There's long wait times for care and for procedures. And then in some cases, patients have died because they didn't get timely medical care. So I'll give you a personal story of mine. When I was in high school, I cracked my knuckle here. While I was playing football, I caught the ball and it pushed my finger into my knuckle and cracked it. Quite painful. So I went to the hospital. I went to the children's hospital after school. So I would have got there maybe at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. I didn't walk out of there with my dad until about 11. And it was just to put the cast on. I had already gotten x-rays done at a clinic. And when we got the results, we went, and it took quite a long time. I would say 8 hours just to get a cast. Now, obviously, people who want to defend it, they would say, well, you're just getting a cast. You're not going to die if you don't get treated. So I understood that. And I'm not saying this as a disgruntled person who's angry. It's more, I'm just showing you what people are saying. In my case, I understood that I wasn't an urgent case, hence why it took so long. But some people in urgent situations who need access quicker for things like a surgery, they don't. And unfortunately, there's cases where people have not. So then people will advocate for things like the privatization of things like clinics. So their private clinics are appearing to meet the needs of those who can pay for it. So the question now is that fair? Is it fair because somebody has more money than me that they should be getting a quicker access to healthcare? These sort of things can create quite a debate. And if we were in class right now, we would be having such a good debate right now, but unfortunately we can't. But I mean, you could be doing it right now in your head, which is good. You're thinking. That's nice to think, and it's nice to see. I can't really see it. But anyways, let's move on. So we're going to move on to human rights and democracy. So Canada is a democracy, and a lot of other Western countries are democracies. So the belief that democracy is a basic human right. We should all have the right to say who and who should not be running or a leader over us. So it's better than a corrupt authoritarian regime led by a dictatorship that enforces strict obedience and do not encourage individual freedoms. So basically, to put it in a very simple way, it's much better to live in Canada than, say, in North Korea, where it is a dictatorship. And yes, they do have voting, which they will say, but there's really only one or two names, and they're from the same party. And it would be in your best interest to vote for at least one of them. But then again, it's only one party, so it's a sham, but it's to look democratic. So more countries are starting the transition to democracies. So following the Second World War, we are still looking at there is a lot of imperialism and colonialism that still existed after World War II, but we saw the breakup of different colonies and the rise of new countries. We talked about India and Pakistan for a few days in class, a few units ago, but that's an example. And a lot of countries went from colony, and then some of them experimented with different forms of government. So sometimes dictatorship, sometimes the military took over, but then now they're progressing towards a more democratic outlook. So sometimes this transition or the resistance to democracy is sometimes it's violent. So there are protests. So if there are countries that are not acquired or not using the democratic system, a lot of peoples will protest it. So that picture we saw at the start of today's video, it probably was, and the word dictator was on one of the posters. It was to kind of create that democratic system. So it's promoting human rights and democracy is a major objective for democratic nations like Canada. So we champion ourselves on the ideas and principles that we are a democratic country where we use things like voting to have a majority agree on certain things. So there is a debate about what their role should be. So for example, should Canada use foreign aid and development to help, or should they use military intervention? So again, another sort of question related to the human rights and democracy. So democracy, it looks good, it sounds great on paper. A lot of countries are using it and using it quite well. There are people who criticize democracies, and they usually will echo things like a democracy is really just a dictatorship of a majority of people. So, for example, let's just use a very basic example. Let's say next year at Bishop McNally High School, they want to have school uniforms. So you'll all come in and you'll be wearing the exact same thing. For some people, and they don't want to just throw it on you. They're going to say, we're going to have a vote. And let's say, I think there was like 1,300 students. Let's say 300 of them say, no, I do not want a uniform. I want to express myself through clothing. So whatever I wear, it's an expression of who I am. So these people are championing things like their rights, their beliefs, their freedoms of expression. But let's say that 1,000 students agree and they say, yeah, let's give it a go. But let's say you are one of the 300 who said no. Democracy has existed in this sort of situation, and it has spoken. Democracy says yes to this thing, to this school uniforms. Essentially, it is the majority who now will dictate to these 300 people how they will live their lives. So some people say that democracy is this form of dictatorship. It's just a dictatorship of the majority against the minority. So there's a challenge to democracy. And I only say this because I want to show you all sides to things. I don't want to just give you a one side of the story. I want to flip it over and just show you the thought processes behind others as well. So, an excellent example of protests for democracy. It happened actually. It happened this year, or last year, kind of before this coronavirus thing kind of took over. You may have seen it. Hong Kong. There were protests taking place in Hong Kong because they felt that the Chinese were pressing into their island a little too much. So, for example, a little brief history. Hong Kong had been a part of the British Empire throughout much of the 1900s, much of the 20th century, actually almost all of it. In 1949, when there was the Communist Revolution, Hong Kong was a colony of the British, and it didn't join mainland China in becoming the Communist People's Republic of China. In the 90s, the British gave it to China. But it has this special status. So it has its own flag. It has its own sort of government set up. But it is still a part of mainland China. So recently, the Chinese government has passed a law that is saying, it said that people who violate violate rules and laws in Hong Kong can be taken out of Hong Kong, brought to mainland China for trial, and then essentially, if they're found guilty, they can be imprisoned in mainland China. People who were advocating for a freer Hong Kong saw this as a supreme violation of their special status and human rights as well, because they champion things like free speech there, and they could be tried in China for these sort of crimes, or these crimes. And they did not like it. So there was a huge protest, and there was actually some clashes between the police. The universities were turned into essentially barracks for students who were resisting the Chinese government. So you'll watch this video here. It's about 3 minutes long. You're going to answer questions 9 to 12 there. But we'll move on. So these next few slides are kind of related to, and these are really good questions related to human rights and globalization. And it's really just a thought process of where do you stand. So for example, in Russia, access to the internet is heavily censored. The government is working to ban websites like Google, Facebook, and Twitter. They are doing this to make sure people do not have access to information that could say things against their government or country. So a lot of countries that have a lot more of an authoritarian style government, they would try to challenge and close these sort of sites where people can openly criticize. So you would have watched the Great Firewall of China, and you would have seen the Chinese response to that. So should Canada stop trading with countries like Russia or China that have been known to commit human rights abuses against their citizens? So this sort of question, it's a question it's always there. What do you do when a country is violating human rights? A lot of times there is restrictions that are put in and put on these countries to kind of put pressure on them to stop. But do they work? Do they not work? What do we do? So that's another good question to think about. So another one here, and this is the last one. Should the Canadian government send soldiers to fight against extreme authoritarian regimes in other countries? Things like ISIS. That repress the rights of their people. Should Canada help these countries adopt democracy? So that's a very, very interesting question. And some people will say things like, if we push democracy onto other countries, is that a smart thing or not? We could just look at things like the 2001 to 2003 invasions of Afghanistan and Iraq by the United States. One of the things that they said they were going to do is bring democracy. Well, we can kind of see that didn't turn out as well as we'd hoped, especially considering that Iraq was involved in a civil war for the last almost 10 years related to the rise of ISIS, and Afghanistan has been it's been in a quasi civil war ever since and there's even still soldiers there from other countries deployed. So it doesn't really show that perhaps that'd be the smartest route, but there's arguments for that as well. So last thing, this on slide 19, I would really encourage you to watch this video. It's called Tank Man. It takes place in Tiananmen Square. There is a lot of information that goes around Tiananmen Square. Maybe I'll try to find a video and put it in the description. I'd give it a watch because it shows the very difficult position that taking a stance for human rights it has. People have died advocating for human rights. So it is a very risky business, but for some people, they decide that this is going to be their life's goal and they will champion it regardless of what happens. So I would really strongly encourage you to watch this. And yeah, so that is it for today. Keep working on your stuff. Keep sending it in. Send in anything that you can find that you didn't do that you're like, oh, I have time now. I'm going to do this, and send it in to you so that I can, mark it, and then we can continue to show your progress that you've made. And then you'll all have really great marks when you're done. So, yeah, that's it for today. Stay safe. It's a little rainy, it looks like, outside, so if you want to go outside and enjoy the weather, you can. If not, I will see you Wednesday.